In this lecture, we will be examining the history of the Progressive Era by looking at some examples from cities in the state of Ohio during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The image on this slide is an artist's rendition of the skyline of the city of Cincinnati as it appeared in 1900. And Ohio, in some ways, especially the cities of Ohio, somewhat represented a microcosm of progressive reform in this time period. So it's useful for us to take a look at these particular cities. Progressive era cities were centers of both immigration and migration, and cities in Ohio were quite typical of the emerging urban culture that appeared in the Gilded Age and Progressive era. In addition, the failure of existing structures to deal with such problems as poverty, crime, sanitation, and education had made Ohio cities centers of progressive reform. Cities in Ohio were among the most forward-looking in the United States at the time. In part, though, this was due to the fact that many cities in Ohio at the end of the 19th century had only recently begun to grow, and some cities such as Toledo, Dayton, and Cleveland were less than 100 years old. This newness of the cities to begin with means that they were less entrenched in their thinking, perhaps, and more receptive to progressive reform. We might consider Cleveland as a case study in examining the wide ethnic and socioeconomic diversity of progressive-era cities in Ohio. In some ways, Cleveland might be considered the most ethnic city in the United States for that time period, and certainly in Ohio at the time. 75% of people in Cleveland at the time were first or second generation immigrants. Many were Southern and Eastern European immigrants. However, only 1.6% of Clevelanders at the turn of the century were African Americans. And real growth in the population of African Americans in northern Ohio, cities such as Toledo and Cleveland would not start to spike until demand for labor rose during the First and Second World Wars. The city of Cincinnati was noted for a number of innovations in fire safety during the Progressive era. The city began to use horse-drawn steam pumps, such as the restored version that you can see on this particular slide here. Modern fire hoses began to be used. Chemical firefighting supplies were put to use to put out fires. 12 new fire stations were developed, and the city of Cincinnati added a fire alarm system that was based on a telegraph system with telephone lines between stations. Samuel Golden Rule Jones was an influential mayor of Toledo from 1897 to 1904. He was born in Wales in 1846, and his family immigrated to the United States in 1849. The family struggled after arriving in the U.S. Jones's father worked as a stonemason and as a tenant farmer for a period of time. As a child, Samuel Jones attended school for only a few years, as his family needed him to work to help the family survive. Gradually, Jones began to find better paying jobs. At age 14, he started working at a sawmill, and he also worked on steamboats as a teenager. In 1865, Jones began working in the oil fields of western Pennsylvania, and the knowledge of the oil industry that he gained, coupled with his savings, allowed him to start his own oil company. The Acme Sucker Rod Company, built by Samuel Jones, catered to the needs of the oil industry that once dominated Ohio. His so-called sucker rods were innovative drills that allowed for deep drilling. In his company, Jones was noted for use of the Christian Golden Rule, or do unto others as you would have them do unto you, as the basis for business, both in dealing with competitors as well as in dealing with vendors and his employees. Jones put into place an 8-hour workday for city workers, which was very forward-looking for its time. He called for the addition of kindergartens in city schools, and during his time in office, he ordered the construction of playgrounds, parks, and a municipal golf course for citizens. Jones reduced railway fares on city mass transit, and he promoted free cultural events for residents in order to instill in citizens a greater appreciation for music and the arts. He was really much more than sort of a legislative-minded reformer, and was very much interested in the holistic development of citizens as opposed to just passing laws. A devout Christian, Samuel Jones was exemplary of the social gospel movement. Jones called for municipal ownership of utilities, though existing state laws at the time frustrated him in his efforts to make this happen. Unhappy with routine police violence against suspects, Jones directed the police department to trade billy clubs for walking canes. In addition, Jones often ordered charges dropped against street people, arguing to police and judges that these people were caught up in circumstances beyond their ability to control. Some observers at the time described Jones as a socialist, but in reality he was an advocate of the single tax system promoted by Henry George. Jones encouraged nonpartisanship, and he often spoke out against the corruption associated with political parties. He ran as a political independent after his first mayoral term. In that first election, he ran and was elected as a member of the Republican Party. This is one of my favorite images of Samuel Jones. It's a bit grainy here. Jones, as I mentioned, was interested in much more than mere political reforms, and he sought to influence the lives of citizens in many different ways. Here, in this photograph, Samuel Jones is demonstrating exercises to students at Toledo's former Congress Street School. Here's another great image. If you can see what he's doing here, Samuel Jones, who at the time was about 60, is kicking a ball over his head. Yet another photograph of him demonstrating, and this is again at the Congress Street School. He died in 1904 at the age of 57. This image was taken just before his death during his fourth term in office. The Toledo Blade reported that 55,000 people viewed his body and approximately 5,000 people attended his funeral. He was well liked by working class Toledoans, although some business leaders looked at him a bit skeptically. Samuel Golden Rule Jones was succeeded by a close associate of his, Brand Whitlock. Whitlock's first experience in politics came when he worked for the governor of Illinois as an aide. After he relocated to Toledo, Whitlock became involved in local politics and was close again with Samuel Jones. After Jones's death, Whitlock was elected mayor of Toledo. He continued the reforms that Jones had instituted and started a number of his own. He was quite popular as mayor and served 4 consecutive 2-year terms in that capacity. In some ways, he was less idealistic and more pragmatic than Samuel Golden Rule Jones. Later, after his time in office as mayor of Toledo, he was appointed U.S. ambassador to Belgium by President Woodrow Wilson, which doesn't sound especially noteworthy, unless you consider the fact that he was appointed ambassador to Belgium in 1914, which was the start of the First World War, and you can see he played a very important role in international diplomacy for 8 years as the ambassador to Belgium. Later had a career, although he had started writing earlier in his life, but had a very successful career as a novelist. Brand Whitlock refused to use police as strikebreakers in major labor disputes, which was rather forward-looking for that time period. He also took a much more conciliatory approach to strikes, preferring to push mediation instead of having prolonged strikes or, again, using violence to break them up. Whitlock, interestingly, was opposed to the death penalty and actively worked to push legislation outlawing the practice, though he was personally unsuccessful in getting this passed during his years as a politician. Although not successful in achieving this next goal, Whitlock pushed for proportional representation, or the idea that a party should receive the same proportion of seats in a legislative body as it earned in votes in elections. So if, for example, the Republicans and Democrats each earned 40% of the vote, they would each get 40% of the seats, and likewise, smaller parties would then have a better chance of being able to influence legislative action as well as get some representation. Brand Whitlock was very much involved in promoting the push for the 1912 Constitutional Convention. These were very reform-minded delegates. They voted against creating a new constitution, so in that way they were somewhat conservative or traditional. They approved 33 of 41 amendments, including making sure that rights of criminal defendants matched those in the U.S. Constitution. An 8-hour day for public workers became standard in the state as a result of that constitution. Regulations for working conditions, workmen's compensation system were enacted at this time. The idea of municipal home rule was pushed as well, and that tradition still is present in Ohio. And at times when the state begins to push for greater authority in matters, Ohio municipalities will still point to this home rule clause as a way to protect their own autonomy. Direct primary elections were passed as well during this 1912 Constitutional Convention. However, despite the rather progressive nature of this convention, women's suffrage was defeated. The death penalty was still on the books, and sadly, race-based laws were still permitted in Ohio after the 1912 convention. So, somewhat forward-looking, but again, Ohio has this history of being, a little bit more conservative in the rural regions and a little bit more progressive or perhaps left-leaning by 21st century standards in city settings. Perhaps the most influential of Ohio mayors during the progressive era was Tom L. Johnson. He was a tycoon turned political reformer whose time in office is associated with a great many changes in the municipal government in Cleveland. Johnson was born in 1854 near Georgetown, Kentucky. He grew up in rather rural areas of the state. His family was not very successful at farming, although during the 1850s they did own a few slaves. Johnson went to the city of Louisville in his teens to try to make a living, dropping out of school to begin working for a street railway company in Louisville. He later worked his way up to the point at which he was managing the company. Johnson is credited with inventing a number of devices for street railways, including the fare box, or at least a new and improved version of a fare box. In 1876, Johnson purchased his own railway line in the emerging city of Indianapolis, Indiana. Along the way, he also invested in other companies, railway companies in cities such as St. Louis, the Brooklyn borough of New York City, and Cleveland, Ohio. And it was in Cleveland Johnson became keenly interested in politics. Johnson became quite wealthy in the streetcar business in Cleveland, and he also owned a steel company, a steel mill that he later sold for a profit to U.S. Steel. This wealth allowed him, I guess, the luxury of being able to pursue his political career. He was in the House of Representatives from 1891 to 1895, the 35th mayor of Cleveland between 1901 and 1909. He was the Democratic nominee for governor in 1903. Of all the progressive era reformers in Ohio, Johnson was perhaps the most influential in American politics. Johnson is noted for a great deal of reforms. He pushed for the modernization of the water and sewage systems in Cleveland. One of his major accomplishments was the construction of an enormous water intake tunnel that brought clean water from deep in Lake Erie to Cleveland residents. Johnson weeded out corruption in the public utilities departments, and his reforms of the city's police department made Cleveland a model for the rest of the country. Johnson also pushed for the humane treatment of prisoners in city jails, and he promoted the idea of community service in place of jail time for nonviolent offenders. Drawing on his business experience, Johnson created a city purchasing department that saved the city a great deal of money through quantity buying and the elimination of waste, duplication, and corruption. Johnson created the first trash removal system for the city, municipal trash collection, and he pushed for the creation of a modern building code in Cleveland. Johnson's revamped Department of Public Works paved, cleaned, and lit the streets of Cleveland, and no longer was raw sewage or trash permitted to be dumped in the street or in gutters. Johnson also created an inspection department that regulated public markets and helped assure food safety for consumers. Lincoln Steffens, the famous muckraking journalist, once called Johnson the best mayor in the United States. And while some of his rivals at the time claimed that he simply substituted one machine of his making for the machines, the political machines that had been present in Cleveland, it is clear that Johnson represented a new type of mayor, and that his innovative policies and programs helped put Cleveland on the map as a major urban center in the American Midwest. This draws to a conclusion our brief look at the cities of Ohio during the Progressive Era.